Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a really interesting gentleman, David Cooper, to introduce you today. He's the principal of Leading Mobility Consulting. He's a transportation expert, and he's come out recently with a really interesting report that really calls into question and challenges the future viability of transit across Canada and major cities across Canada because of the lack of funding, not for infrastructure, which is something that I've been really focused on in the past, but because of operating expenses. And it's really quite an interesting conclusion that he comes to. David has got, what'd you say, almost 2 decades of experience in the transit business. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
So tell me, this report you came out, I think it was a couple months ago, the answer was what? That we've got a crisis in funding of transit systems?
Well, we've had a broken funding model for transit for several years. So before the pandemic, most transit agencies are funded through municipal property tax and transit fares. That's what you have for the TTC. That's what you have for Mississauga. You have for Brampton. Basically, most transit agencies across Canada. And then comes the pandemic. So when a lot of agencies get about almost half their funding from transit fares, and you have this collapse in ridership, and then the collapse of fare revenue, and then it slowly trickles back up when you through a multi-year recovery process. You end up having this structural deficit of your day-to-day operating. So fortunately, the federal and provincial governments came in and provided emergency operating funding for the first time, just to maintain service levels and make sure we still have that connectivity. And then the third part that's happening is people have come back to transit differently. We have different travel patterns. We don't have people coming in the office 5 days a week. So I'll give you an example, like in Toronto on the TTC, 26% of the ridership on the TTC was the 9 to 5ers that were coming in 5 days a week. They don't do that anymore. Maybe got 2 to 3 days. And then we have different ridership patterns. So we've seen a lot of growth in transit service to like industrial areas, to kind of more logistics supply chain. Brampton has actually led the country in transit ridership recovery, which has been well reported in our sector. So we have different ridership patterns. And then the third problem that's now come is that we have this transit renaissance of building transit. We didn't build a lot of it for about 20, 25 years. And now we're getting all these LRT lines that are opening. Now we're getting, subway extensions, new bus rapid transit services. So we couldn't afford to run what we have now from the broken model we have now. People are coming back differently. And then these major projects are now turning on with operating costs that we need to find money for. So it's been this kind of perfect storm of three things that have been really growing for a good period of time, but now they're all coming to fruition at exactly the same time.
I think it's interesting that you say that Brampton and industrial ridership, industrially oriented ridership is up. Explain that if you could.
So when we had the acute parts of the pandemic, a lot of the ridership that did maintain onto the system was supply chain, logistics, service sector, healthcare, a lot of ridership in the airport, kind of in the airport employment lands. I actually did a project with My Way in a partnership with Toronto Metropolitan University on looking at equity service standards when it comes to employment. And we went on the Dairy Road bus, the 42 at 5:30 in the morning with my class back in late 2021. It runs every 6 minutes and it's full. Like you're leaving people behind. So
This
there
goes
was
from
such
where
a
to where?
growth.
This is along Dairy Road.
Uh, this goes from Westwood along Dairy Road, along kind of the north edge of the Pearson Airport lands, kind of west towards northern parts of Mississauga, but it's very much an employment route. And it runs every 6 minutes, it's packed. And we've just seen such significant growth of ridership in that particular area. In Brampton, they've doubled down on investing in bus service and bus rapid transit on the Zoom network. They're in Brampton, there's a lot of multi-generational households. There's a lot of trips that just kind of radiate from each household, and you obviously can't take a car for all those trips. So that's incurred additional transit ridership, which has been great. But we still are losing some of our market share when it comes to that 5 day a week office worker, which has caused a bit of a pressure on our operating budgets, let alone now we have all these new projects coming online. We got to find a way to pay for those too. So that's been kind of, I'd say, more of the 905 story on it and maybe the western part of our region.
It's interesting. You said it was part of a transit equity study. I've long argued in Mississauga, Brampton area that some of the best, if not the best transit we've got is for the more wealthy people in the south end of Mississauga, taking the GO train to downtown Toronto to those well-paid banking jobs. And some of the worst transit we've got is in the north end, going along Derry Road from Malton to the industrial areas. Sounds like you're actually saying I was right and you're agreeing.
It really depends how you look at it. Like, if you want to have obviously a fast trip on a GO train, that's a one-seat ride that, I would say is a high quality of service. Yes, like that definitely exists. But the amount of frequency and service that we're seeing to even get to these employment areas is quite high, which will be, which is really feeding the ridership in that part of the region. Obviously, there's always room for improvement, in terms of the quality of service or level of service we provide here in Ontario. LRT, when it opens, is a north-south spine across, obviously Mississauga and Brampton, which will connect to a lot of those particular areas, and you'll have a lot of service that's radiating. But when we look at the ridership patterns of, let's say, Mississauga Transit, a lot of the increase in the ridership have been those kind of north-south spine routes up north of the 403 and then up into those industrial areas, and that's where they have been putting some of their service investments in the
Fascinating.
last couple of years.
And so it's really the more industrial jobs that are making use of transit, which from a sort of a societal standpoint makes sense.
It makes sense, but I think one of the challenges, and this might be a bit of a side note to this, but we have a high level of service. But if you get off the bus on Derry Road, you're walking across 8 lanes of traffic, past a parking lot, into a logistics job. So the quality of service may be there, but I would say, the physical space and maybe the comfort of that trip is not there, just because of the way we've developed certain parts of our particular region. And that's always an area for improvement, but we are seeing a lot of those service investments. But at the same time, to keep those investments going, you got to have a proper funding model to actually pay for transit service day to day.
So what's the proper funding model?
We need to diversify what we have in terms of how you pay for day-to-day service. So back, most agencies like Mississauga, Brampton, pay for it through municipal property tax and transit fares. So just as an example, 45% of the revenue for Mississauga Transit came from fares. The rest was from taxes in 2019. That went down to 36% because we had that reduction in ridership, and it's slowly kind of crawling back up. It was 50% in Brampton. Now it's down to 43. And these are, transit's a pretty significant budget line item. Like, transit service in Mississauga is $250 million a year. Brampton's just under 200. So when we talk about a proper funding model for transit, it's like when you retire and you have a mix of a portfolio of investments, right? Because you want to be shielded against other kind of external factors so that you always have certainty in your investment portfolio. It's the same thing for transit. So we've had some transit agencies like in Vancouver where they have a 24% parking tax. So that provides significant revenue for transit operations. They have 18.5 cents a liter on fuel. So what they've been able to do is have differing diverse funding sources to pay for transit service, but also add to the level of service where they've had significant uptick in their ridership recovery, and actually some of the fastest because they had a high quality of service. The issue in Montreal, vehicle levies pay for about, I think, 5% of their transit service. So there is differing kind of tools that we've seen. We've seen sales tax, we've seen congestion charges, we've seen things like that. But I also don't want to be naive that, taxpayers want to see the traceability of what they fund to level of services. That's how you generally support for that. But also, there's one taxpayer, and obviously taxes and fees and revenues are not exactly the most popular thing.
I've had other people on talking about congestion taxes or road tolls, and their argument always goes to, well, roads are free other than the 407, and transit's not, and it's actually sort of backwards that you think about from a societal standpoint. It's lower income people that are using transit that should have the subsidy, not higher income people that are driving their fancy cars on the Gardiner and the Don Valley. What do you say to that?
I think the concept the discussion of roads are free is a wild misconception. And the reason why I say that is that there's cities that spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year in fixing those roads. So when that road crew is on the side of the 403 fixing it, MTO is paying those contractors to fix that road. When Peel Region or Mississauga or Brampton are repaving your streets or are doing rehab work or they're doing snow clearing or unclogging drains from yesterday's, issues that you saw on Dundas Street. Like those people don't work for free. There's pretty substantial cost to that. So, and you do pay for it out of your tax bill. I think the challenge when you see with transit is that transit has a model that, there's a user fee to it. You collect a transit fare. So there is some recoveries off of that. You don't get that from driving. You pay the 100% cost of your road infrastructure off your tax bill.
No, but that
And
was my
that's
point, is
either,
that there's not a
yeah,
user fee to
yeah.
roads, that roads to the user are free as they use it. You pay through the tax, but it's free as you use it.
I would never say roads are free. I think how you pay for them is basically the visibility of that. Like you are correct. Like there's no user fee unless you take the 407. I think the challenge when you have things like the challenges when you have things like road tolls or congestion fees is one, how do you define where to put it? How do you charge it? How do you do the actual implementation of it? The thing like for the 407, it's much easier from an implementation perspective to do a road toll on a controlled access freeway because there's only one way in onto a freeway, one way out. There's externalities when you let's say have a zone for congestion charging because what might end up happening is if you don't calibrate it or develop it right, businesses could say, hey, I'm not gonna operate in this congestion zone because hey, like if I go to the next municipality over, they don't have one, right? So I think it's a hard sell. Like New York City was just going to have a congestion charge and they got federal approval, they had state approval, they put the technology in, and then at the 11th hour, the governor pulled it. So, and a lot of it is about the conversation around affordability and really understanding, okay, if I pay these fees through, let's say, a user fee or a roll toll, where's that money going? For them, it was going to transit improvements, but unfortunately, people got full cold feet at the last minute and pulled it. And that happened back in June.
Fascinating conversation we're going to have today. Just 2 minutes of a message break, and we'll be back with David Cooper talking about transit. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting about transit. And interesting, tonight we're talking about sort of the operating model. Usually I've been speaking about infrastructure and investment, but David Cooper is with us tonight. He's the principal of Leading Mobility Consulting, and he's come out with a major study recently about how our transit funding model is broken. David, let's take a step back for a sec. How did you get into this gig? How did you get into this role of analyzing transit systems and their funding?
I think I was just a really nerdy kid. Maybe I'll start there. So, I always wanted to be a city planner since I was 5. And the reason why I learned about city planning is I grew up in Edmonton. And this is going to sound like a tangent, but I think it's an interesting story. So, the provincial government back in the late 80s gave the city of Edmonton funding to create a River Valley park system. And my family lived in the park actually in an area with a couple of side streets in a valley and they wanted to build this multi-use trail, this bike path. And the only problem is the bike path was in the direct route of 6 houses, and my family lived in one of those 6 houses. So I learned about city planning because we actually got expropriated by the city of Edmonton when I was 5. And so I had a pretty good crash course of about like infrastructure, oddly, where our house was taken for a bike path. We
You
got
got expropriated for a
compensated
bike
path
Oh my
in
God.
Edmonton in 1990. And so, which is not a typical, I think, Alberta story. But anyways, no, the city treated my family well with the process and everything. And but I learned firsthand, obviously, the impact of decisions and how cities function and grow. And I was always fascinated about transit because when you look at public transit in cities, one, it was the structure of public transit is different in every city. You know, how you take transit in a city like Calgary is different than how you take transit in a city like Toronto, you know, in a small town versus a big city and things like that, right? And then as I grew older and became an urban planner, and I'm like a certified land use planner by trade that does transit now, is I see the role of transit and how hundreds of thousands of people rely on it every day in many city per city. And then the other part is I see how cities grow around transit. So it became a much bigger thing than I'd say like a bus going down a street or, you know, kind of being a little bit of a train nerd. So I think seeing that role and impact, and then what I've kind of learned through my career over time is that we've had some structural things that for us to be successful, we need to address. And one of them is the things that we have to be a master at to make people want to take transit is clean, safe, and reliable. And we can't do reliable unless we have a service that is accessible, that is there for you, that is convenient, that you can actually access, that is frequent. You can't do that unless it's properly funded. So that's how I really got into this. But also the other part too is when you work for transit agencies, and I've spent most of my career on the agency side, we've been talking about the funding problem forever. And to be honest, I'm kind of tired of the cyclical conversation where we need to now start really building the case to our government funders and the public about actually addressing this structural issue that we've always had with how we actually fund day-to-day service. It's one thing about the big ticket projects that we're seeing a lot of construction on, especially here in the GTHA, for building out transit, but it's another thing. The unfun part is how do you actually pay for it every day? And that's something that is always been rearing its head for many years and something that's really coming to roost right now, which was really my interest in it.
I ended up having a really interesting conversation with a transit consultant that was working for Metrolinx, came from Toronto, but was based in the United Kingdom. And he said that we've got this perception in Canada and the United States that all transit systems can never break even. And he said, no, in England and in much of Europe, they do. And it's because they've got lower expenses and far better service. So people want to make better use of them. What do you think? Is that true?
So the way that we have it developed in North America, it does not create like there is revenue streams in terms of like how, you know, passengers pay for fares and to offset some of those costs, but transit is not in the business to make money. And even in places such as in England, I'll give you an example. Transport for London requires subsidies from the taxpayers. They get subsidies from local and national government there. So you know, the UK government actually relays gas tax money. It's is we looked at some of the G7 countries and how they do with day-to-day operating, and they relay some of the money back from fuel taxes to transit operating because transit systems don't offset a lot of their costs. How different agencies offset their costs is different. Go Transit's a really good example. Go Transit had one of the highest cost recoveries for many years. You know, I remember 15, 20 years ago, they were about 90% cost recovery, which is unheard of in North America. But the reason why they do that is with their pricing structure. It was basically you pay for the quantity you take, right? So you pay a higher fare on the distance you take, and Go Transit because they're a regional service with high distances. You know, they had very specific understanding of the market demand for those particular services and also what I guess people would obviously pay for that. We just don't see that. We don't, that model doesn't really exist in other components. You know, Hong Kong has been an international success story on generating revenue because, but they have a different kind of situation where they have a development arm and an agency that maximizes building out around the MTR stations on the rapid transit system to build, housing and commercial, but they also have to do that because I've been to Hong Kong, there's no land. So, 2 million people live on Hong Kong Island on basically one or two streets that span the island. So, the land economics and access to land there is a lot more challenging. Transit is a public good. Public goods sometimes recoup some of their costs, but they are not profit generating machines. We are not, public services don't do that. So, and transit, unfortunately for some folks in their mind is one of those.
So you're saying that Hong Kong realizes revenue from development. Is not Metrolinx doing that currently with with the Ontario line and the Eglinton Crosstown that, I think that there's some development that they're specifically going out to get ministerial zoning orders to get increased density around transit stations and then building either themselves or in partnership with private developers. So are we looking at that model of exploiting some of the development opportunities?
Funny you bring that up because I actually wrote the national paper on transit and housing last year, so definitely well versed on that. So what's happening is there is a transit oriented community program from the province where they're looking at some of the key projects like Ontario Line to look at development opportunities in housing at the station areas to one obviously increase the housing supply in our along our transit system and our transit nodes to help generate ridership, which also helps generate operating costs and help pay for that service, but then also looking at opportunities to potentially get capital contributions through, integrated development or joint development at particular sites. That is something that's being done. It's something that, I think agencies all across North America are definitely looking at. And I think in order to do that, we're now getting to the point where we're having extensive enough systems and we are able to integrate some of our planning process to do that. So that is something the province is looking at here. But I think also the other part of that is, building housing and having these joint developments are long plays and they're very complex. So I worked on the Broadway subway extension that's under construction in central Vancouver right now, which will open in a couple of years. And we have some integrated development that's occurring. There's one at the corner of Granville and Broadway. They're building a 39-story tower on top of an underground station. And when we were doing the concept planning and getting ready for, the contracting components of building that line, the planners wanted integrated development because you want to build those housing units, you want to build those opportunities along the line, but then also the constructability. And I think they figured it out, like they're doing it. But to have a third party building into a public piece of infrastructure together and the integration piece in terms of timelines and financing and implementation is very challenging. And if you're willing to work through that puzzle together, there's opportunities to do that. And I think you should. And I think the provincial government is moving forward on that. And right now we need housing, and housing on transit is also a federal priority right now too. So I think the stars are starting to line on that.
It may be challenging, probably is challenging, but I think it makes a ton of sense. I'm aware that at Leaside Station on the Eglinton Crosstown, which is at Bayview and Eglinton, on top of the station, they're building, I think it's 35 to 40 stories of a building in a public-private partnership. And then just recently, I was going down Avenue Road at Eglinton, and right at the corner, in the northwest corner, is this gorgeous built station, taking the prime spot at the corner for just a station, nothing above it. So it makes sense, doesn't it, to make use of that, the air rights or the development opportunities and do something other than just build a grandiose station.
Well, I think you actually nailed it right in the head there, Brian. So there was a lot of conversations during the planning phase of Eglinton Crosstown, when I was at the City of Toronto in the city's planning department about getting the integrated development, and there was decisions made at the time because of that complexity I just mentioned about, you have the public infrastructure and you have the scale, scope, complexity of building an underground transit line in the middle of Toronto. Do you want to add the complexity of also integrating development from a third party? And the decision at the time was no. For putting more certainty on the overall project, was that the right decision? From a planning perspective, I think there's opportunities to integrate transit and housing. And if you can do that on these major projects, you should. I think the province has a different thinking on this now, where they are trying to do that with some of these major projects to, one, build the housing that we desperately need in our region, two, to get the ridership on the system, and three, hopefully get some contributions towards the capital through, arrangements and agreements and things like that. But it's not something it's good public policy, like people get it. I think there's a lot of construction technical details that just make it very complicated, but I think it's worth doing. And we're starting to see a bit of a shift on that with new projects.
I've been shocked at the number of huge structured parking units that I see Go Transit build at major stations across the Lakeshore line, the Milton line, etc. I wonder, does that make economic sense, or would it be better to electrify the line and just have more stations rather than these huge parking structures?
So the irony is that Metrolinx and Go Transit are the largest parking provider in North America. They actually own 73,000 parking stalls, and which is evident when you go, drive down the 401, you see Pickering Go. There is a massive, parkade. I was at Cooksville not too long ago, massive parkade, right? So, um, one of the things that has occurred with the evolution of Go Transit is it was really kind of the idea is, have people get to the station, which, obviously through driving or biking or transit. And because you have these suburban stations and suburban areas that were always low density, that didn't have the high quality transit service in terms of frequency or directness, they built a lot of parking structures, which consumes land. Parking stalls could be anywhere from ten to $15,000 a stall to construct now. Structures are even more. From a planning perspective, to help justify things like electrification and two-way service and good planning principles and densifying, and creating really employment nodes and housing opportunities in areas like the 905, the park and their public lands too. Developing those parking facilities is probably the best thing to do. And there are some stations that Go is looking at and Metrolinx is looking at for that. I think there's always been a lot of conversation about leveraging public lands for housing. It's a very popular topic, especially during election time, and that's obviously an opportunity. But also to do that opportunity, those parking structures were never, they don't have the utilities, they don't have the sewer lines, they don't have the power hookups that you need to actually do some of the development pieces. So there's been some conversations, and I know myself and some of that transit and housing work, which we're actually going to be releasing a second updated report on that this fall, is there is federal money on the table right now to put in the infrastructure to actually facilitate housing. And I think you should be prioritizing those public sites that we already own the land, to, especially at transit sites, to actually help us get some of the servicing in so we actually can start building the housing units on these particular locations, because they are such a massive opportunity. There's been a lot of conversation here in the GTA about the green belt and going more outward, but we have so much land internally within our communities, especially at these Go stations. We just need the ability to, one, have the transition to have some of that land for housing opportunities, and two, to actually get I guess some of the pre-work done so we can actually develop these particular sites. So it is something I know on my mind and a lot of other people's mind right now.
You mentioned that the Go Transit had a higher fare recovery system, cost recovery system through the fare box because they were charging for distance effectively. I know
Yeah.
that in the TTC Toronto and other agencies, they've looked at that system, and I guess because of confusion, cost of actually implementing the computers and the fare box system to allow that, they haven't done that. But I've traveled in London, England, and in Paris, France, and in both those places, it's done fairly simply with a card, and you pay for, I think, zones that you travel through. Why don't we have a system where we pay for distance?
That's a complex question that I definitely have an answer for. So there's a whole bunch of factors to that. One is technology. In order to do distance-based fares, you have to do tap on and off, and we don't do that on things like the subway. When you do tap off, depending on the technology, there could be a bit of a lag and delay in terms of that. There's a lot of back-end systems that you need to have to do tap on and off. There's a lot of customer communications you need to do on that. Vancouver was going to do tap on and off on the bus system, but the lag time to actually tap off on the buses was so high, it would actually incur service delays. So they actually just didn't do it when they implemented their fare card. They have zone-based fares on the SkyTrain system, but they do tap on and off, so you can do that. I've been to Sydney, they got tap on and off. You have some examples you brought up there, so that's one component. The other issue with zone-based fares and distance-based fares is that there's equity implications to it. So unfortunately, we have a disconnection between where people live and where people work. And a lot of the times where we have our concentrated employment areas, The housing around them is expensive, and those who work in the service sector or healthcare or sometimes more kind of shift type work, which pays a little bit less, their travel distances are greater. So we actually would be punishing those who have lesser abilities to pay through a zone and distance-based system. That's one of the trade-offs. But then again, are you paying more for more of a system that you take? That's another component. You know, at the end of the day, it's 325 to get across Toronto. You could take it from the edge of Scarborough to Pickering to the edge of, Mississauga to Etobicoke for 325. Does that make sense? Probably not, but there are implementation, equity, and just operational components and customer communications pieces that give us why that's the flat fare system that we have today.
Um, Opposite side of the question, I was in Manhattan recently, and I was speaking to a transit person. What they got there is a system that if you use your Metro Pass more than, I think it's 10 times, every further use is free. And the rationale they had there is they want people to use it for, quick stops. They said that the problem that they had was people were only using it because of the expense if they were going a long distance. And what they stopped doing is making use of it if they were going to stop or two, because they were going to shop, they were going to go pick something up, they're going to go from here to there. And they said they wanted people to do those quick on and off usages. And so they developed a system where if you used it more than a certain number of times a day, it was free. What do you think of that?
So yeah, the concept of fare capping of basically topping out at a certain number of trips is something I'm supportive of. I've seen that, and Edmonton's going to be doing that. Portland, Oregon has that. I saw that when I was there, and it obviously benefited from that. Several other cities. So it basically incentivizes you to take as much transit as you can because you're not getting, dinged every time that you're taking, a significant number of trips. I think the hesitancy from transit agencies is that there is a revenue impact. It's marginal, to be honest, in terms of you may lose some revenue on that. But if you're building that behavior where you're going to keep taking transit, you're not worrying in your mind, I'm like, oh crap, like I gotta go pay another 325 if I don't get on by this, 4 o'clock today. Or like if you start taking away some of the equations that people have to put in their head and you basically reduce those barriers for people to keep taking the system, I actually think over time you would probably actually gain more ridership and the revenue issue would probably not be an issue. So from a customer experience perspective, it is a great thing to do. I would like to see it. I know the TTC has talked about it, but there is definitely a revenue implication. But at the same time, like, TTC has improved the ability, like they have 2 hour transfers now. You didn't have that for many decades. You only can go one direction, one trip, and they got rid of that. And there was a revenue impact. So you can do more little trips now. And that's the next step to get the fare capping. I think it's something that could be done. The more barriers you take away from people taking public transit, the more likely they're going to take it. And definitely things like fare capping help with that.
What about differential pricing? I had another consultant recommend that what we're doing is we're building for the peaks, and what we got to do is try to spread out demand so that we don't have to build more capacity just for the peaks. And so that they said that in London after 10:30 the price goes down fairly dramatically. What do you think about differential pricing during the day?
We do have a little bit of that. Vancouver does off-peak pricing after 6:30. Washington, D.C. and their metro system used to do that because they were trying to shift trips from, let's say, 8:30 in the morning to 7 in the morning to do that. But they did abandon that because it was actually rather confusing and it was pretty marginal in terms of the amount of people that shifted. It is a tool in the toolbox, but it's not something that's going to solve the issue. If you have crowding congestion issues, it's because you have a concentration of people trying to get to one place. And in order for things like that to work, is one, obviously the service levels have to be as high earlier in the service day. Two, the employers have to play ball too, right? So at the end of the day, when you have those types of processes or the ability to do the differentials, the employer typically dictates when you start work. So if there is obviously alignment with that, that's something that could be potentially done. And it's a customer communications piece. Like it's something that, you could technically do with some ease. It might solve some of the crowding and congestion issues, but it's not gonna, let's say, defer a big capital project that you might need. Like it might extend out your ability to provide the service for that day, but it's not something that's gonna overall, I think, solve maybe some of the capital things that you may need down the road because of crowding and congestion on your system.
David, this is a really interesting conversation. I appreciate you joining us. We're going to take another message break and be back in 2 minutes with David Cooper, who is a transit expert and has recently come out with a report on the transit funding model and the broken system that we have and his recommendations for changing it. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm chatting with David Cooper. He's the principal of Leading Mobility Consulting. Since 2005, he's contributed to numerous transformative transportation initiatives. I think I got that pronunciation right. Transformative transportation initiatives across Canada. He's the founder and principal of Leading Mobility. As I mentioned, it's a transit planning firm that offers strategic and planning support for public transit infrastructure delivery, stakeholder support, and government relations projects and initiatives. He is the only urban planner in Canada that's practiced in the public sector in Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto, providing unique customer perspectives on how to successfully shepherd politically sensitive projects through large municipal and regional governments. He has worked on the Relief Line subway, the King Street pilot in Toronto, the procurement support for the Broadway subway project, the development of TransLink's battery electric bus program in Vancouver, and the implementation of the LRT BRT expansion and regional transit in Calgary. David, I got to ask you, we seem to do a terrible job in building transit. We're over budget and behind time on the Eglinton Crosstown, on the Huron-Ontario LRT, on the Ottawa LRT. What's wrong? You've studied these businesses. You've been in these agencies. You've consulted to them. What's going on?
I think there's a lot to unpack on that question there, Brian. There's a few things that I think has occurred. One, we didn't build a lot of major transit projects for many years, and when you have that lull of projects between, let's say, 15 and 20 years, Toronto's a really good example. We had the Shepherd extension that opened in 2002, and then we didn't have anything open for 15 years until 2017 when the subway went to the York region. So when you have this lag and lull, we didn't upskill and develop the expertise to deliver these projects. So we've had to rely on bringing others from all over the world, which also does have benefits. We didn't upskill our labor or provide that labor capacity to actually build those projects. And then we've also been plagued with the same market demand issues that we've seen when it comes to materials, supplies, labor access, X, Y, and Z. And we've kind of come up into a situation where it's not just we've had these complexities with projects in Toronto. Just this week, there's $2 billion more that's going to have to go to a SkyTrain extension in suburban Vancouver. We've had additional costs adding to an LRT project in Edmonton. Green Line LRT in Calgary is having the same issue. The projects you listed are having the same issues. And part of the issue is one, that lull, then we started building, and then we started building everything at the same time. So when when you have an economic market internationally where it's very challenging to get things, supplies and materials from, concrete to copper to, X, Y, and Z to build these projects. And then Vancouver's building 2 projects right now. Edmonton's building 2. Toronto's building 7 without the GO Transit expansion. It's not even including that. Ottawa's building 3. Montreal's building 3. So we're all fighting for the same crew of technical people to work on these things, and then we're all fighting for the same labor for these things, and we're all ordering materials at the same time. So this is where you start getting these cost escalations. Then the other part too is complexity. We're building major transit in the middle of some of the most urban parts of our cities. So you're going to have complex utility issues. You're going to have community impact issues you need to mitigate. You're going to have all these different complexities, and it's just all happening at exactly the same time, which is a challenge. But then also, my hope is that we will start seeing the fruition of the benefit of these projects in the very near term, because at the end of the day, they're projects for the public good, and that's what I think is happening right now. Is you had a lull, then we had market conditions, then you had everyone going to market at the same time. You're having everyone trying to build everything at the same time. And it all kind of comes out into this one big complexity that we're seeing on the major projects all across. It's not just in Toronto and Ottawa, it's all across Canada right now.
I heard from a lawyer that is involved in the situation that the problem is it's too litigious, the relationship between the provincial agencies that are building and the contractors that they hire to build. And that the procurement process is a problem that leads to contracts that end up being legal documents that have to be litigated, and the litigation goes on for a long time, which stalls the actual completion of the projects. Is there any truth to that, do you think?
Well, at the end of the day, when you're building a multi-billion dollar project, there are going to be complex commercial and legal implications and considerations on it, right? So, we are using public funds to contract out, and you need these contractors, they're the ones that are going to build the projects to build these projects. There are certain things that can be done to help that. The assignment of risk is one of them. So one things that you can do to de-risk projects is having, let's say, municipalities help out with utility work, to help out with the early works to get things prepped for the particular area, to work, concurrently with contractors to kind of deal with complex technical issues. There's a lot of work that's done to really understand what is the scope of the project from a design perspective, and having performance requirements and things like that. And the assignment of risk is huge on those pieces. But at the end of the day, like they are complex commercial and legal agreements because we are spending billions of dollars per project. Like you need to understand what are you building, what are the structure of how we're particular building the project, how do you pay for the performance and the progress of the overall project, and so forth. I'm not a lawyer. I've obviously been involved in some of these components, but at the end of the day, like they will always be a complex commercial and legal component because again, we're building public infrastructure that impacts people that will also benefit the community, but also needs to have those guardrails of, okay, what is the scope, schedule, budget for these particular projects, and how do you move forward on that from a commercial legal perspective? That's just something that is just a given on these things. I don't see how it wouldn't be something that is complex, unfortunately.
David, if tomorrow morning Premier Ford made you Minister of Transportation, what would you do?
No one's ever asked me that. But man, I would love to have that role to solve some of these crunchy issues. I think one of the things I would love to do just on this particular subject is actually have the province come forward with a sustained funding model for transit operating. I think we're very fortunate to get the support for building these major projects. We had a lull in building out our transit network, especially here in the GTHA, and we're seeing such historic levels of investment, which has been great. What's been very interesting from the provincial government side that has been very noticed lately is the provincial government will be paying for the first 3 years of operating for Eglinton Crosstown and Finch West. That is unheard of provincial government to actually pay for the operating of a new capital project. If we can find a way for the provincial government to help cities sustain levels of service and actually help, like people will levitate to transit if you make it a reliable and accessible option. If they can come forward and help us deal with the operating funding component, that would be huge. And I would love to see that. And that would be where I'd put a lot of my head. It's not sexy stuff. I'm not going to lie. Sexy stuff is building new lines and cutting ribbons, but right now we can't afford to actually run what we're going to open. So if you can, I want to make sure we maximize the benefits of these historic investments that we can actually run them and people taking the service and having access to it and actually not having to worry about, potential, down the road cuts or service, restrictions, how to provide that service. I think that would be huge. And that's where I would focus a lot of my efforts. So there's a few other things I would love to see, like if the province would, change things in the traffic, in some of their traffic acts on bus lane cameras and other things that would help things like King Street and more enforcement on our transit lanes. I'd be thrilled on that. And that's totally in the wheelhouse of the Ministry of Transportation, and the Traffic Safety Act or things like that. I would love to do that too. But again, not a sexy thing, but things that are practical that would actually help us run day-to-day service is something that would be of my interest.
So the King Street project of having streetcars only and no traffic going beyond one block, you agree with? That makes sense.
I worked on it, so yes. I was in the city for that one. So
So
we
more
did,
more
we
enforcement to make sure people don't breach the regulations.
Well, and the other part too is like the reason why that project came to fruition was that streetcar, you could walk faster than the streetcar. We had the data at the time for that. Like you could physically, like the streetcars were moving at 5, 6 kilometers an hour. A typical walking speed is 5, 6 kilometers an hour. And when you have the busiest surface transit route in the city and one of the busiest North America, and a streetcar is $150 an hour, a transit vehicle in the street is $150 an hour, and it's just sitting there. We need to move on that. And one of the big challenges with King Street is twofold. One is enforcement, which is improved. We have traffic agents down there. I don't think it solves it. I think we need more regulatory tools for enforcement on things like King Street. And then the other part too is that the temporary infrastructure in King Street has fallen apart, and we need a bit of a vision of what the permanent King Street will be. And I'm awaiting to see what that is from the city.
David, I was talking about transit a little while ago, and someone came up to me and said, Brian, this is stupid. In a couple of years, we're all going to be driving autonomous vehicles. And so all these parking lots, all these GO trains, all these LRTs aren't going to be needed because the autonomous vehicles are going to be 2 inches apart going down the Gardiner Expressway and dropping us off. We're not going to need any parking lots downtown because the autonomous vehicles are going to then leave again. So this is all a waste of time, money, and effort.
I think with that, and I've heard that argument before, there's actually not enough space for that. There's not enough space in our road network to have vehicles driving around even at 2 inches apart from each other. There's also like who's going to actually have access to these autonomous vehicles from an access, perspective is going to be affordable to everyone. I don't know. We don't have a history of having equitable transportation options for everyone. That's why we have differing, travel patterns, differing modes, because there's a different price point all the time from taking transit to driving. Parking lots are not going away. The vehicle's going to have to go somewhere at some point. So, in terms of I'm not a physics professor, but in terms of kind of space and time, I don't think it's actually feasible or practical for the autonomous vehicles to take on the entire transportation network. And frankly, like we have snow, we have ice, we have cyclists, we have pedestrians, we have all these other components, and they have not figured the technology out for that. We have, that's something that is, will happen. Will there be a progression towards that over time? Yes. I think autonomous vehicles and controlled access highways is great. It actually will increase the safety on things like the QEW or the 427 and things like that. But I still think it's a long way out. I don't think it's going to be a full transition either.
David, I really congratulate you for your report on we have to fix the broken funding model and your comment that it may not be sexy, but it's needed. I interviewed a gentleman who said this is the problem with government writ large, is that we've got too many people that are interested in the big sexy stuff, but what we have a real problem is actually delivering what we plan to put in place, and whether it's passports or transit or border controls or this thing and that thing. And he said what we need is a whole bunch of chief operating officers. We've got a whole bunch of senior ministers and deputy ministers and assistant deputy ministers that do all the policy stuff, but what we need is the guys that actually do the non-sexy implementation stuff. And so thank you for the role that you play. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Brian, for having me.
I am going to take a break and come back with some final comments in just 2 minutes. David, really appreciate your involvement today. Thanks.